Hello and welcome to a new podcast here on Actual Spirit. Today we're talking about a very special topic with three very special guests. The topic today is religion and spirituality for the 21st century. We're mainly going to be talking about it from our personal philosophical standpoints in a universal manner, though, however, also mediated by each of our own singularities and how we have approached these own topics in our life and have experienced them. So the first question I want to ask you guys, and let's start with Daniel, is the question: what is religion?
Well, Dimitri, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you. That's a good question right there. We can pull out about 20,000 books on that one. It's really interesting because when I was thinking about this conversation, obviously we can talk about binding, what you bind yourself to, religion, and so forth. And it's interesting because there seems to be such a line between when you talk about religion versus mysticism and spirituality, where religion is some sort of mediation of the spiritual. But then, of course, there's always this tension. Like if I'm speaking out of Christianity, so many Christians are so quick to say, Jesus isn't a religion. Right? Like religion is bad, but then to kind of specify a difference between what Jesus teaches and the religious practices of his day. But then, of course, without any sort of religious practice, it's hard to have any conceptual mediation. It's hard to have shared intelligibility between different people and things like that, and so on and so forth. It would seem to be that religion, if we want to make distinctions between that and spirituality, which of course is very difficult to do because you can't really have religion as authoritative without a sort of spiritual dimension to it. Now, of course, it depends on what tradition you're speaking out of and what you mean by religion and so forth. Religion seems to have some sort of habit of a series of habits of practices relative to something that cannot be reduced to yourself, and yet nonetheless you need to be part of. It also seems to be a space that can make meaningful distinctions between will and want, per se, like I want to do X, but I need to will to overcome X because it might not be good for me. For example, let's take smoking. You go, oh, I want to smoke because smoking is great and cool. But then you realize, no, I need to will to overcome that, right? And a religious space can be one that can help you make distinctions between want and will to maybe define your want in more meaningful ways from will or with will, or put them together and things like that. The other thing that I think is interesting about religion, I've been thinking about a lot, is that I think religion has traditionally had a lot to do with social arrangement, in the past. Like, how do you organize a society had a lot to do with social capital, like where people would gather, where they would meet. There'd be a kind of habit to the community. Every Sunday we meet at X time. And if you know that your neighbors are all going to the local Methodist church, then you can assume certain things about how they see the world without you necessarily ever having to ask them about it. There's a shared intelligibility about that, right? Now, of course, the danger with religion as social arrangement is that it can conform everyone to a certain arrangement. It can stifle creativity. But of course, where there's creativity, there can be a lack of that very shared intelligibility. And what's interesting to me, if I were to take language from a really wonderful book called Exclusion and Embrace by Michael Wolff, he talks about where we need to think about religion not so much in the business of social arrangement, but today social agents. What does it mean to have a social agent? And to me, that's very interesting, especially as you move, because that book will make a lot of Belonging Again Part 2, is because social agent seems to be a kind of phrase that is between a societal arrangement and then just kind of a free-floating individual. Because if you're not going to have the societal givens like you had in the past, it seems to have something to do with the way that the individual and the subject mediates themselves and carry themselves in the world. But how do they do it in a manner that is still socially engaging with other people? And so there's this question of the social agent. And for him, the question of religion comes down to the categories of exclusion and embrace. And the million-dollar question that I think is really, really difficult that religion, at least from a Christian tradition, can speak to is the incredibly difficult question, and then I'll pass it on, of forgiveness. Forgiveness is a really difficult topic. And in fact, it's one that I think we can avoid, but say a religion like Christianity really wants you to face. What does it mean to forgive and not be contributing to injustice or enabling evil? What does it mean to have forgiveness where people can have a second chance and have thus freedom to experiment and to explore and try their own communities without ending up, say, exiled from the community? And so for him, religion is going to be in the name of figuring out how to navigate forgiveness with the other, because for him, the most radical act of openness to the other is forgiveness. It's one thing to talk about openness to the other when they're really kind of still similar from you because they have a similar worldview and they've never hurt your feelings and they've never done anything that makes you mad. But for him, you're really not talking about the problem of otherness and the problem of learning who to embrace and who to exclude unless you have to face the problem of forgiveness. And I would actually say today that that's a major issue that people don't know how to navigate. When they feel like the people around them are contributing to injustice, or they're destroying the country, or they're tearing down, what we build up, then I can't forgive them because they're the enemy, right? That would actually enable them to keep doing it. And so the problem of forgiveness, if I were to say what's kind of interesting to me to frame the question, is a lot to do with the question of religion helps us think the problem of forgiveness, and grace, and then openness to the other. And then, of course, it also has a lot to do with mysticism and the spiritual and things like that and mediating that. But it also has something to do with how to relate to the other in some of the most difficult circumstances. Not just the other in a way of kind of a cheap, shallow diversity as someone like a Hunter or Philip Reef or all these people would talk to, but an encounter with the other where you bind yourself to the other when you're darn well aware that they've hurt you and will continue to hurt you. So the questions of forgiveness and grace are interesting to me. So those are some thoughts that come up.
Oh, thank you. Layman, do you want to go next on the question, what is religion?
Sure. The first thing that always stands out to me is how we have tended to conflate a small range of religious examples with the phenomenon of religion in general. So we have these mythic membership, basically believer cults based on cosmological and pseudo-historical narratives from sacred texts. And the groups that do that are very happy to assert themselves as the normal example of religion, and the critics of religion are equally happy to have those be the normal example of religion. But they certainly are not. There's all kinds of pluralities. There's all kinds of emerging religions. There's religious phenomenon among people who would not self-identify as religious. And by far, the greatest religious period of human history was the hundreds of thousands of years before written texts or even cities. So when we pull back and look at all of that as the playground or arena for religious phenomenon, I think we need something like a functional rather than a dogmatic interpretation. Like, it doesn't matter what they're claiming about reality, how are they operating? And the way I see them operating is as a kind of interpersonal or social analogy to the way spirituality operates in the individual. It's the bringing together of a bunch of diverse systems to create a kind of gestalt effect, what I call a numinous surplus coherence that's more than the sum of the parts. That produces phenomenon like peak experiences in the individual, which can be lensed as a first, second, or third person entity and then used to navigate and transform your life in a kind of idiosyncratically unfolding pattern. The same thing can happen between individuals when they can come together across classes, across disciplines, across genres of cultural activity, and create some kind of additional coherence effect, essentially a generated apotheosis of the community back to itself. And that can be perceived as a great entity. It can be perceived as a force. It can be perceived very generically as a spirit that moves among us when we're engaged in participation in this particular way. And to the points that Daniel was making there, one of the things that affords us is the ability to have an extra degree of meaningfulness that exceeds our normal behavioral investments, so that we can will to do things that are different from our habits or our instincts, or collectively will to do things that fall outside of the socioeconomic paradigm that we're in. So that we need culture to operate at the degree of religionization in order to be able to pull off adaptive change. And when we pull off adaptive change well, then we reinforce this sense that we share some kind of divinization, that our collectively shared experience reaches the degree of divinization. And I think we're essentially in a practical deficit. If we don't have that, we can't really adapt historically, but we're also in an experiential deficit. We lack something fundamental in our experience of ourselves and each other unless we are able to operate the engine that generates this excess.
Okay, thank you very much for your answer. What about you, Cadell? What is religion?
I mean, it's in many ways, it's a question that's been with me since I started my intellectual journey. before I was 18, I didn't even really think too much about bigger picture questions. I was really just concerned about hitting a home run. And in some sense, that was my religion. My religion was hitting a baseball or trying to get into an end zone. And when I started my intellectual journey, it started with an older man sitting down beside me by a lake and pointing at animals and saying, "Did you know where these animals come from?" He said, "Well, they come from God." And he gave me all these books on intelligent design. And that sort of launched in some sense, it launched my curiosity into what became exploring evolution. And so my first exposure to religion and the question of religion was really in the context of a very particular cultural debate in the United States between intelligent designers and evolutionary thinkers, between basically the idea of a supernatural creator and organizing a society around a supernatural creator, and the idea of the world as purely explainable and socially rational through evolutionary mechanisms. Now, there are many complications and paradoxes with that particular cultural antagonism. And I suppose that I started to experience those antagonisms when it came to my intimate life. In other words, my view of the evolution and religion debate as it's sort of presented in the United States and North America sort of lost its grip on me when I started to encounter problems of heartbreak. Heartbreak in myself and heartbreak in the other. And in some sense, that's my starting point for my spiritual quest. It's in some sense the location where I would even say that I encountered anything like what is a soul. I experience my soul, I guess, in those moments of heartbreak with the other, where there's basically where you feel like there's no one, like where you feel like there's no one who has the answer, where there's no one who can help you, and there's no answer, and you're just left with this deep pain and deep ethical confusion, I would say. And ultimately, if I was just to give a short sentence of what I think religion is or what religion means to me right now, I would say that it's something related to the mediation of instinct across an entire lifetime. The mediation of instinct across an entire lifetime, that means inclusive of personal drive. That means inclusive of your family life. That means inclusive of your sexual relationships and your relationship with the others, especially in intimate context. And the big paradox there, just to bring it full circle to where I started to think about these things in the intelligent design and evolution debate, which is kind of stale now. It was hot when I was 18, but it's kind of stale now. But the interesting thing there is, if I'm saying religion is somehow related to the mediation of instinct across a lifetime, there's an interesting paradox where the evolutionary worldview, which is usually seen as antagonistic with religion, actually introduces the potential to think religion in a deeper way than I think it's normally thought. So usually we think, oh, because we evolved, because we came from nature, because there's no God that created the universe in 7 days or whatever, that is a threat to traditional religion. But actually, I think that it brings us precisely to that point where we can think about, what does it mean to be conscious? What does it mean to be self-conscious in such a universe? I think it brings us to questions and mysteries that were probably the original motivation for religions cross-culturally. Whether that's Christian, whether that's Buddhist, whether that's Hindu. So that's basically how I see it. I see religions as different cultural strategies for dealing with our evolutionary history in civilizational context.
All right, thank you for your answer. So just to summarize for everyone, what I understood from all your answers is that, Daniel, for you, religion is a habit of practices. This is one way we can conceive of it, and also as a social agent, of which the ground is forgiveness. Now, this is very similar to how Hegel conceives of religion in the phenomenology of spirit, because at the end of the spirit chapter, it ends in forgiveness, and this is actually what opens up the chapter of religion. And this is fundamentally about our relationship to the other. Now, it should be evident that this is also very much tied to what Cadell answered about religion as the mediation of instinct, which is primarily about the sexual energy, which does not only mean the sexual relationships, but also familiar relationships and relationships with other people. And we can actually, shed light on religion by means of evolutionary theory. This is not only, we shouldn't just view this in an antagonistic manner, and this is definitely the spirit of the conversation. So, Layman, for you, you immediately wanted to get rid of this answer of religion are these mythic membership cults. Religion is way bigger than this. It's way bigger than just the texts and a doctrine and just a dogmatic identification with those texts. Religion is about a divinization on a societal scale. And spirituality, according to your answer, would then be that same kind of mechanism, or at least similar on an individual basis. That's what I understood from it. And this is always connected to some kind of transcendent beyond. Now, the way that we conceive of this is different throughout a lot of cultures. So this transcendent beyond may be monist or dualist, for example. There may even not be some kind of beyond in, for example, what we find in Hegel's philosophy with the concept of true infinity. Perhaps that could open us up to new conceptualizations of religions that have a different view on that kind of transcendent beyond in a perhaps a Platonic form. Now, my next question, and let's go in the same order, is what is spirituality and how do we distinguish religion from spirituality?
Oh, well, that's a good one right there. Well, that is actually what's difficult about the conversation. I really appreciate everything that everyone was saying. I really think what Layman is saying about this notion of what does it mean for us to know we create the quote unquote excess, or the thing that is in excess to us, and that thing that we create then has authority over us in some certain way to meaningfully divide will and want. This, to me, I really appreciate that framing, because not that I'm trying to plug the book or anything, like belonging, again, basically you go through where you describe how societies have organized according to givens and releases. Now you're in an age where you're conscious of how givens release as a background to make shared intelligibility. And what does it mean to belong again, which would basically mean some sort of form of belonging that is not belonging according to traditional ways. And that gets into the children of Nietzsche, absolute knowers, Deleuze, all of these different questions, which in Nietzsche, the line I keep coming back to is the notion of you create a law and hang it around your own neck. Like, what does it mean to create a law? Like, you created the law, you know it's arbitrary, and yet you decide it is not arbitrary over you. This seems to have a lot to do, and I agree. Like when I'm saying, for me, religion has a lot to do with forgiveness. I want to clarify, I'm not saying it's just about forgiveness. To me, if we're asking what religion is today in the 21st century, which would make it, say, distinct from all these new social organizations, these new communities, like a lot of them can provide all the things that religion has always provided. But one of the kind of glaring problems is, for me, that if religion is to have a role, it is to really kind of zoom in and focus on this question of forgiveness. Like, what does it mean to forgive people that... So, for example, you're in game B, you form a community where you strongly believe we need to have a sustainable relationship with the planet, and if we don't, we're all going to die. Well, you have an alternative community that they all claim they're environmentalists and they care about the planet, but they actually are all invested in Exxon, Shell, oil companies, and they have Roth IRAs, and they don't see that as immoral whatsoever. and you feel like they're freaking hypocrites, right? How should you relate to them? Like, what does it mean to forgive them and it not be enabling them and to be open to them, and yet not in a manner that then destroys the very foundation of your community? That's why the question of forgiveness to me is a massive, massive deal. And religion may have a use as a social function distinct from spiritual in really focusing in on that question. One version of religion, not all religion, but a version of religion is, how do you as a subject carry yourself in that situation, right? Where whatever you do, everyone in your community may think you're betraying your mission. You yourself may not know if you're enabling evil or not. You're trying to live with that tension, and you bind yourself to that split, if you will, to that deadlock, to that problem. You bind yourself to it, and you don't look away from it. That to me is really important. Like, just thinking about when Rutt was talking with Frege and Owen Cox, and Frege and Cox were kind of stressing, the pathos, the irrational, and all these things eventually come out. And, Rutt was saying, well, we can all agree that we need to have a sustainable society and different things. It's like, okay, that's true, but I've never met anyone who disagrees in the need for a sustainable society. It's just that people disagree on how or the severity of different things. And those people who disagree on the how are going to probably view the other person as immoral or part of the problem. How do you relate to that person? That's the deepest problem of otherness. And spirituality will probably have something to do. That is, I think, when you start getting a little bit more into the metaphysical, where you start getting into the question of the bigger picture. We can obviously talk about beatific visions in different Christian traditions. You can talk about, obviously, emergentism is something that people are working on, and different things like that. To me, and I really appreciate also, and then I'll pass it to who wants to speak, Cadell was having those wonderful conversations on psychedelics with Peter Rollins and also Dr. Hughes, and the need for metaphysics in order to mediate the mystical, or else you can get chaos or sort of splitting apart. Or, Peter Rollins made that wonderful point where people have a psychedelic experience and they say, oh, we're all one, therefore the homeless guy on the street is one with me. And so then you don't do anything to fight homelessness, right? Because you have this mystical vision that makes it all cosmic unity, right? So there's something about the political that comes out in the distinction between the religious and the spiritual. And yet, this is the funny thing. In the past, people gave authority to the religious practices by the mystical vision. Say, if you believe in God and God came as Jesus and he died for your sins, therefore there's a certain way that we should politically carry ourselves. Whether you buy that or not, that's a different matter. What does it look like to have religion that is spiritually informed, that is politically relevant or socially relevant, that actually is able to then relate to the other in a manner that negotiates the society you want to live in, right? Because what we said earlier is now we're creating our own laws and hanging us over our neck. Well, wait a minute. Let's say I do that. Let's say I'm a Nietzschean child and I create a law and I hang it over my neck. How do I get you to hang that law over your neck? Or how do I get you to relate by your own law with my law enough that shared intelligibility is possible, right? What does that look like? To me, that actually gets into questions of beauty. I actually think Nietzsche has something to say about beauty. I like the absolute idea that Cadell was talking about beauty, because if I'm beautiful with that law around my neck, it may attract you to be more like it, and your law may attract me to be more like you, and now we start integrating together, right? And we start working together, and beauty as a form of negotiation may have something to do with it. So then I would say this. I would say spirituality has something to do with your source of beauty. And then religion are the practices by which you express that beauty in a manner that then attracts other people in the society to organize according to that beauty. So there's an aesthetic vision that would come here. Now, those are just some initial thoughts, but I think the questions you're asking are really good.
Yeah, 2 points on religion before I say anything about spirituality. I think it's worth considering the idea that science is always an implicit part of religion, although the science and religion can be out of phase. Like 11th century science and 11th century religion, great match. 21st century religion and 11th century science, terrible match. You get an insufficient or pathological version of religion. Just because people think they have religion doesn't mean they're doing it well or competently. The other thing that comes up for me is, how do you, what's the zero level of forgiveness, right? It's sort of like, What's the basic friendliness between two citizens, regardless of their social position or category? And we see this played out in the gospel over and over again. Like, in order for this religious machine, this device to be working, the minimum you would expect is some kind of fundamental solidarity between individuals and citizens that can then grow into these more transformative capacities to forgive. So a lot of people today define themselves as spiritual but not religious, indicating that they have confidence in some kind of personal process, and they don't see an analogy to that socially that they can have robust confidence in. What is that personal process? For me, it's the integration to the point of coherent excess of different subjectively active internal intelligence systems. And the real simple example I point to on that is Gurdjieff, who has like a heart, mind, body approach. And if you can get through practices a relative balance between the amount of subjective attention and feeling you're putting into your heart, mind, and body, then you can get this additional effect that he refers to as beingness, right? And the ability to do that and the effects that that has and the way we mediate it back to ourselves and the way our life is then changed and navigated differently on the basis of that makes us a person with a spiritual life per se. And I think the essence, the thing that really defines that the spiritual experience that can grow into a spiritual life is that the coherence exceeds the field of cognitive and perceptual objects, right? And that's what people normally point to with enlightenment. Something is outshining the rest of the contents of our cognitive map and also forcing forth a new space that would enrich our perceptual and cognitive map. And I would tend to define mysticism apart from spirituality and religion as a specialization into a particular range of experiences, right? In integral theory, we might call these state experiences. But if a person wants to really prioritize subtle or dream or imaginal or emptiness or happiness or the physical realm, whatever it is, if you want to over prioritize one particular realm, then you end up with an effect which is mystifying to the other people who are not doing that. But you also end up doing something which has mystical significance to you, but doesn't quite achieve the unfolding spiritual development potentials that would come from integrating that with other experiences and other domains of reality. So for me, mysticism is a specialization in a particular range of state experiences. Spirituality is the production of the excess through the integration of internal subsystems, and religion is that same integration, but the stage of genres of interpersonal activity.
All right. Yeah, it's an important distinction. I'm going to start with the Hegel quote that the mysteries of the ancient Egyptians were mysteries to the ancient Egyptians themselves. And the way I'm going to flip that is with the idea that the mysteries of the neoliberal capitalists were mysteries to the neoliberal capitalists themselves. And what I mean by that is that irrespective of whatever your particular views are on spirituality, religion, or whatever, I really feel like the medium or the layer which is organizing the social body today planetarily is what I increasingly find useful is the idea of techno-capitalism. And techno-capitalism is basically the relationship between a hysterical subject trying to figure out the other, and the other being either the market or the algorithms. And, you know, throughout the development of my intellectual career, I've always said, I'm not going to follow the market and I'm not going to follow the algorithms. However, there's a limit to that. There's a limit to that. Because at a certain limit to that, you just end up poor and disappeared. Like you're just not there and you're just poor. So you can't do anything. So there's a dimension of techno-capitalism which is objective. And you have to have some sort of relationship with this other. And to really develop a relationship with this other, it's an emotional roller coaster because you're absolutely not in control of it at all. It's something which always, and it keeps you thinking as well. So there's a way in which I think sometimes anti-capitalists and anti-technologists, when that's too simple, there's a way in which that critique can also be a way to shut down self-responsibility for the unconscious in regards to the lifetime mediation of instinct that I was mentioning before, and to actually keep thinking, right? A lot of times people don't realize how much they actually don't want to keep thinking, because if you keep thinking, I mean, you're going to be constantly transforming. You're going to be constantly becoming other. That's inherent to keeping thinking. Now, I'm going to give a little bit of a structure here, which I've been working on since I've taught philosophy, been teaching at Philosophy Portal, and hopefully it's helpful. As I mentioned, I got into this religion science debate in a cultural climate which was really dominated by the new atheists. So, and they were my first big influences. You know, when I say the new atheists, I'm talking about Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett. Of course, there's Lawrence Krauss, there's others, right? And they're all different fields. I think that moment of culture was basically the moment where reason thought that it could control the culture, right? Reason could dispel with faith, and reason could organize society without the traditional religions. Now, I think that cultural moment has passed. No one really thinks that anymore. I think that the moment in which I was doing my doctorate and the last few years, especially around coronavirus, and what I see in the online circles, is basically an intellectual environment which is on the level of spirit, basically where people will emphasize their own little metaphysical view, where people will emphasize their own metaphysical practices. Here, I might even sort of reference the idea of the ecology of practices, where basically the idea is more on the level of spirituality, my individual spiritual relationship to the divine. Now, the problem with that, as Daniel already pointed to, is the level of the other. And what I would double down on and emphasize in the context of techno-capitalism is the political. And the political, I want to think about the political, because I'm teaching right now on What is Sex by Alenka Zupančič. Now, if there's a central message in What is Sex, it's not simply identifying with psychoanalysis or something like that and Freudian views of sexuality. That's not like that. What Alenka is trying to say is that the sexual has imminent political consequences. And even Freud himself didn't understand this. Like, Freud was in some sense kind of naive about politics. And many Marxists have criticized Freud for this. The point here is I want to connect this idea that religion has something to do with the mediation of instinct and an imminent political antagonisms. And imminent political antagonisms on the level of a new technological layer, which involves algorithms, artificial intelligence, who knows what's coming next, which has imminent challenges for very basic notions of identity. I'm actually going to quote John Vervaeke. So John Vervaeke in a recent podcast was talking about, I really appreciated this as well. Genuinely appreciated it. So John Vervaeke was talking about how he lives with his son and how his son can't afford to buy a house. And his son is a biology teacher in high school. And that in the 20th century, that would have been able to support a home. You would have been able to support a home as a biology teacher. But today, in our current environment, we've got, now Dimitri, I'm not a boomer, I'm a millennial. Okay, but this is important. I'm a millennial. And millennials are basically in a situation of feeling economically and politically disenfranchised, in the sense that we can't organize a life world over the course of our entire lives. We don't feel like, and even for the generations coming up behind millennials, it's even worse. There's no capacity to think that I'm going to be there's no capacity to think that there's a place for me on the course of my life where I could settle down with a wife and have kids and raise a family and become a father. It's not that it's impossible, but it seems increasingly impossible. And when you factor in technological ways of acceleration, this is where if you look at theorygram, now here's something that I think is really important for those of you. I think it's really important to pay attention to what 20-year-olds are memeing about. Not what older people are memeing about, what 20-year-olds are memeing about. If you pay attention to what 20-year-olds are memeing about, there's a lot of catastrophic, apocalyptic visions of accelerationism, where when I was growing up, the accelerationism was more utopian, this idea that technology was going to bring abundance, where technology was going to bring us a new world. Now there's increasing ideas that technology is going to destroy the world, and that technology is going to disenfranchise us to the point where there is no world anymore. So it's not like we're in a transition between two worlds. It's that we're in a world that's disappearing. So that's where I would want to bring the conversation of religion in the 21st century, is it would have to engage the sexual, the political over the course of a whole identity's lifetime on that level.
All right, thank you for your answers. And just today, I was reading an article by Mladen Dolar called "The Future of Authority." Now, he starts talking about how Hannah Arendt wrote an article called "What is Authority?" And this is the title of the article, but she immediately goes into what was authority and then posits that in the present, there is actually, as a matter of fact, a crisis of authority. Now, in the article, Mladen Dolar actually argues that this is authority as such. There's always a crisis of authority. You can go back to Plato and he will say that there is a crisis of authority and it is not anymore like it used to be. However, Cadell, specifically on your point, Mladen Dolar goes into a famous paper by Immanuel Kant called "What is Enlightenment?" And what you just said about basically the new atheism movement is kind of perhaps the last the last screeches of Kant's "What is Enlightenment?" that posits that by reason we can get out of our so-called self-incurred immaturity. This is the claim by Immanuel Kant. In the same article, Mladen Dolar says that even someone like Foucault, who, as we know, spent his whole life on the question of authority, power, and institutions, and how relationships are always influenced by power, at the end of his life was like, this text by Kant is basically what we have to return to. And now I think you're right about making the point that this is not possible anymore. So this is what opens us up to the dimensions of spirit and religion. And yeah, you're right. Freud also didn't see this himself, and he was some kind of Kantian in this sense. Now, on the mediation of instinct, there's basically, to summarize and oversimplify Hegel's theory on it, there's basically three ways to mediate instinct or to sublimate instinct. One would be art, which is making sensible of the absolute in whatever form that comes to you, which would be music or painting or poetry. Another one is religion, which Hegel says represents the absolute, and we can think about Orthodox Christian iconography, for example, and also other religious imagery. Another way is philosophy. Now, what is philosophy for Hegel? Well, in the Science of Logic, he says it's rational theology. Philosophy is a service to God. And now, what is God to Hegel? Well, in the Phenomenology of Spirit, he says that God is love. So philosophy as rational theology seems to be kind of a ground of developing some kind of basis of a perhaps higher order relationship to the other, perhaps grounded in forgiveness, or at least deeply related to it. Now, what do you guys all think about this triad? What do you guys think about the aesthetic nature of the absolute? And given what everything that has been said already, let's go in the same circle that we've gone into.
Oh, you've got all the good questions, Dimitri. I really appreciate everything Cadell was saying. I want to make clear, one of the reasons I've been emphasizing forgiveness is precisely because it brings you to the realm of sex, suffering, politics, family, and all those things. Because like marriages and relationships are where people are constantly hurting one another. You have misunderstanding of a sexual relation. You have you don't understand what people are dealing with at home, and you talk to them a certain way at work, and then they're deeply hurt. And then politics is a constant exchange of pain and different things. And so forgiveness is interesting to me because it precisely kind of hurls you into the space where it is only a truly meaningful term, or a deeply meaningful term in the space of the real, where the real is breaking through and smacking you in the face, and you're like, F this, I don't like it, I'm going to go back to the symbolic. No, I'm going to be open to the other, but I also am not going to just be Achilles and kill the other. How do I go about doing this? So to me, it's kind of an interesting framing. So just to clarify, really, I definitely think like theology, look, like some of the better books, whether you agree with it or not, or like Theology of the Body by John Paul II, some of the books by Richard Niebuhr, talking about politics, where they're dealing with the real as opposed to just some sort of metaphysical vision of different things. All three of those that you mentioned in Hegel have some weird thing to do with when I'm looking at something, I'm also looking at something else. Like, let me take art as an example. You know, art is not reducible to just the paintings and the canvas, right? When I see art, it goes beyond itself, right? Religion, if religion is distinct from just a random social, well, not random, a social arrangement, there is something about the religion that goes beyond itself in itself. That funny Hegel language, right? And so likewise, philosophy is also something that is, you're talking philosophy, but you're also talking to philosophy because you're trying to get at some whole that you know that you have to fail at getting at, and yet the very failure somehow points to. So there's this pointing to all of those, right? One of the things, Westphal, I can never say his name, but he wrote a tremendous book on Hegel, and he also wrote a wonderful book on God, guilt, and death. And somewhere in there, he's talking about Heidegger. And Heidegger there's this kind of point on the problem of everydayness, right? Where it's like the doorknob that works is invisible to you, right? And so you only notice the doorknob when it breaks. For Heidegger, there's two issues with this. One, it means that maybe all of Western philosophy is a long story of asking questions that pulls you out of everyday life, and then you're asking questions about that state of brokenness from everyday life, and their philosophy goes down the wrong path because the asking of the question could break the daily way that the average person lives their life, and you're philosophizing therefore about an abstraction, right? So there's a problem there. But then, of course, how do you ask questions philosophically without breaking the everydayness of which constitutes your everyday life, right? What the heck does that mean? How do you do that, right? Like, how do you do art that points beyond itself but also meets people in their everyday? How do you do religion that points beyond itself but also meets people in their everyday? How do you do philosophy in a manner that doesn't get lost in abstractions? This is that great problem, right? That we're kind of wrestling with. But anyway, what Westphal talks about is how in, say, religion, art, and he talks a lot about Hegel, like precisely if you know that there's some otherness, some maybe sacredness or ideas, then that always makes you less vulnerable to being captured by the everydayness that then turns you into just kind of a clockwork where you're going forward. Like if you go, wait a minute, there's a God. Well, then, bam, reality can't capture you so easily in that very everydayness because you're always questioning it, right? Like if you take art seriously, the ability of, paints on a canvas to point beyond itself, whoa, wait a minute, phenomenon can exceed A as A and somehow be AB. Whoa, that's crazy. And so that helps break you out of everydayness. But of course, here's the problem. The very breaking you out of everydayness is what can open you up to otherness and not just being a mechanical clock or whatever. But that's also what can pull you into abstraction, right? Like you can break out of everydayness, leave it behind, have a totalitarian vision, and try to conform reality to that totalitarian vision. You can get into an abstract philosophy that has nothing to do. So to me, religion is precisely classically something that provides a break in the everydayness to help you from getting captured by the everydayness. You could even use that Heideggerian language of clearing if you want. But the risk of religion is precisely that breakage that then pulls you out of the everydayness. And so you leave behind the real, you leave behind the political, and you start thinking abstractly, right? So religion in the 21st century has to be a break that doesn't break you from, per se. It has to be the deadlock. It has to be the crack. We've talked about lack. It has to be the split that binds you to the break. Like religion is binding to the break. So you stay in that place to think the real, where you're not just going with the everydayness, but that means you also have to deal with all the negativity that comes with that. So I think all three of those in Hegel kind of point beyond themselves, that then makes you think beyond itself. I can definitely say, you know, it makes me think, there's another great, and then I'll pass it on. There's a wonderful thinker, he's a poet as well, Mark Edmondson. And he actually wrote a relevant book called What Football Teaches. And I actually think that offers a lot of what religion today can do, because I think religion today is probably more like a gymnasium in a Plato sense, but also a training ground. It's a wonderful book. Mark Edmondson is really good. And he talks about how he did football. And it was really dangerous because it can create sort of groupthink, violence. You don't learn to train your anger. But then on the flip side, he says, but it actually trained me to overcome adversaries. It trained me to be tough. It trained me to do things for myself, even if nobody agrees with it. So he's really has a tragic vision of football as both something that enhances, but also can danger. And he talks about character, and he says, character is necessary, but it also can threaten imagination. It can trap you within the terms of the world that created that character. But then if you don't have character, when you face negativity, say when you're trying to do your own creative enterprise or imagination, you might not be able to overcome it. So that kind of tragic vision, I think, thinking football, and there's more to say on that because he also makes a fascinating distinction between Hector and Achilles in that book. Anyway, something about that tragedy, thinking in terms of religion, and thinking about how religion is good in breaking us from the everyday in those three forms that Hegel said, but that's precisely the risk. Because when the everyday is broke, you can break away from. There's the risk of that. But if we don't do that breakage, well, then we just get pulled along by the everydayness, which then, of course, leads to can lead to the mass of a social movement, a totalitarianism, a alienation, and all those other things that Heidegger talks about. So I think those three kind of help frame in their very phenomenological experiences very interesting tension. But let me pass it.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I think the question is not really should we have the transcendent or not have the transcendent. It's that how do we do it such that that break is empowering rather than regressive and derealizing. If you look at society and you divide it up however we want to into various categories and go, there's aesthetic activity and ethical and philosophical and political and hell, medical and health activity. There's all kinds of different genres of activity. And then there's a question within each genre and between these genres as to how they're being organized. Within the genre, is there a good mix of people and intelligences and systems bringing information into it? And is it basically being more or less organically organized around goodness, around value, something like that in an unconstrained manner? And then are they being inter-organized with each other in a way that cross-fertilizes and cross-challenges them and then brings forth a living coherence that they can have in common that we can operate with transcendentally? So if you're doing that well, then you get this kind of religious effect, which is really empowering and offers transformation for people and even sets up subdomains of personal transformation. Like philosophy, when it's included in a system like that, is a way of personal transformation, not merely a set of contemplation of the propositions that describe reality. So there's a way to do that really well. There's a way to do that that creates a kind of a regress where the system starts to fail and rotate back towards a simpler mode of organization, which relative to the one you're currently working on is something like a tragedy, something like an apocalypse.
Dimitri, would you mind just giving me the question again?
All right, so I will question it in a different way. First off, to finish my point on Kant's "What is enlightenment?", to specify what is exactly the point of that paper. The point is that all that it takes for us to go beyond the irrationality of mankind is to have the courage to do away with the imposition of tradition and authority. and to just go off by the self-justification of reason alone. Now, to go back to the question, of course, Vervaeke talks a lot about the meaning crisis. And Mladen Dolar wrote a paper that I will link in the description, in which he has the following quote. To put it in a nutshell, to follow Freud's image, the unconscious is a gap and meaning is the stopgap. So it's a very simple quote. Unconscious is the gap, meaning is the stopgap. So we have an unconscious crisis in this sense, perhaps. And the question here would be, how do we... It's inevitable that we want to have... We need this stopgap. We need symptoms. We cannot get rid of symptoms. The question is, can we have ways to desire a stopgap on thinking that crack? Or can we use religion or spiritual practices not as a stopgap to the unconscious, but as a means to tarry with the lack in the other and the psychic symptoms that are the result of that?
All right. A lot of my work, I feel, is in some sense about this, in the sense that, how to approach it though. I think that no matter what, there's no way to plug the gap in such a way as that the real is gone. The real is basically the opposite of your desire. So like, the real is basic, like whatever you desire, you always have to be prepared for the real to thwart it, to undermine it, for things to go the way you don't want. Right? Like yesterday I was traveling from Belfast to London, and I thought I was going to get in at 11 p.m. And as soon as we board the plane, they say they forgot to hire the cabin crew. So the plane's just delayed for 3 hours. Right. And then I get into London at like midnight, and the only taxis available cost me double what the plane flight was. Right. This is the real. The real is always going to be there. Now, the question is whether or not, now, deviation, then what you get when you confront the real is simply violence. Like your first instinctual, animalistic, if you want, reaction to the real is just violence. Like you want to tell the cab driver, get the hell out of here. I'm not spending $150 on a goddamn cab, right? What's at stake in the instinctual mediation is basically to overcome the immediacy of the instinctual mind, which has a violent, and this, if we go back to Freud, if we go back to Girard, there's always this taking us back to the primordial violence, the primordial murder. What's at stake is understanding yourself on the level of that, but being able to mediate that in such a way as that it's beautiful. Like, as many people have been, I think both Daniel and Layman have been talking about the importance of beauty and aesthetic, which is capable of maybe when we talk about, for example, Jesus walking on water, for example, like I like to think about these metaphorically. Like Jesus walking on water is kind of like the plane's delayed, the cab costs more than the plane, and you smile. It doesn't affect you. It doesn't impact you. You just keep you always choose to look at the negative and flip it into a positive. That's a very simple way of seeing it, but that idea has been with me since I was in middle school, and that idea has got me to where I am. When I was in middle school, I was chubby and I got cut from the baseball team, right? Or when I was in high school, I failed high school and people called me dumb. Every time I just flipped it into a positive. So the real is always going to confront you with that. And I think what's at stake is turning the immediacy of a beautiful object of escape, where you escape the real, into just a process where you are, in some sense, walking on water, if you can. If that makes sense. Now, however, I just want to say one thing here, is that what we're talking about is the relationship between the imaginary and the real. So you have the image, which is beautiful, and you have the real, which is the opposite of your desire. But what's missing in this equation is the symbolic, and the symbolic plays a very important role on the level of either philosophy, religion, or art. Is that the symbolic is going to be the logic which you derive from the real to navigate and orient yourself in the real. And you can't bypass the symbolic. And bypassing the symbolic is always what people want to do. And the bypassing of the symbolic is either on the side of the real. It's the overemphasis on like nihilism. It's just the abyss. It's just the real. It's going to destroy us. I'm just going to die. Oh, eventually we're just going to be destroyed by something. And then the imaginary is like, I'm just going to over-identify with beautiful images, right? As a defense against that real. So both of those are traps. You need the symbolic, and that's why training in philosophy or training in deep text, it obviously could be theology, it could be science as well. But most importantly, probably above all, above religion, above science, above philosophy, I'm not playing favorites here with anything, is the capacity to derive categories in the real. Like, and that means simply derive categories with your friends and with your family and going on a walk in a park with your intimate partner. That's the symbolic. And that's so important. And I think that's really important for young guys to know today, is to stay with that mediation of the symbolic, not as a worldview, but as the imminent conversation. And so before I pass it on, I'll just say one thing. I remember I went to go visit Žižek in Slovenia, and I was asking him difficult questions. And one thing he said to me, which has stuck with me, is, that's a question for your own immanent logic. And that stuck with me, because what he was saying was basically, look, the questions you're asking, I can't answer them. They're just going to be things that you figure out along the way in your logic, you know. And so that's where I'll end up.
Yeah, thank you again, everyone, for your answers. Let's have one more round, and you can give your last ideas and kind of a conclusion statement. So let's go in the same circle again.
Well, that was all marvelous. There's a few things. First off, I think that association of walking on water with the real is very good, because water is associated with the realm of the Leviathan and chaos and different things. So if Jesus is walking on water, then he is certainly walking on the quote unquote real. And that's where it's saying in the Revelation, when it says stuff like, there will be no more ocean, this is part of paradise, because that means the realm of the chaotic is gone. And likewise, if you go to Genesis, and it's out of the dark waters that the Holy Spirit floats off and create, then it's creating out of the real. But then, of course, that means the real is always undergirding everything, right? And it's always lurking in different things. And that also gets into some stories of where the snake comes from, if God made everything good, or so on and so forth, is because, you can never, the real always has to be located there. There always has to be the water. So I think that's a good metaphoric association. I think it's a good association. I think basically for me, what you were saying about the symbolic is so big. I personally, like on the conversation about religion, especially religion today, if it is to have some sort of function, then it has to be kept as close to the symbolic as possible. Now, it can't be totally kept close to the symbolic, because precisely when you talk about religion, you will be talking also about metaphysics, mysticism, spirituality, those things are going to go on in the same way that in Lacan, all those things can go together. The conversation always slips into one or the other, but keeping religion on the question of the symbolic is huge. Also, I think it's really important that the categories of art, religion, and philosophy, there's a version of it that is the individual impact, and then there's the social, like the collective impact, right? Like this would get into someone like Roger Scruton. He would basically say all three of those is culture. And if everyone basically has read similar novels, if you are in the if you're born in Virginia, maybe the people next to you have read William Faulkner, Flannery O'Connor, Hemingway, they've listened to similar bluegrass music, and they go to church, right? All of that then means that everyone is carrying around inside of them similar kind of sets of ideas that then also kind of says we are together because we share those ideas. And this is precisely the symbolic according to which we deal with the fact that we got to go to work, with the fact that, John's sister just died last week, that I can't have any kids, that I got to go to a 9 to 5. Like this structure of culture provides ways to mediate beyond your own resources that you have, because you can tap into something larger than yourself, the great conversation of literature, music, culture, so on and so forth, to then help you deal with the fact that your wife is dying of cancer, or that you don't have a job anymore, right? So for Roger Scruton, basically the death of culture is really dire, and it's going to lead to atomization and then nihilism or different things, because people don't have something they share that is beyond themselves, that makes me go, oh, everyone here doesn't just ascribe to AAA, everyone here ascribes to AB actually, and in fact that B is one that we relatively share, that B being the beyond, that then we can talk to about one another and gain strength from, right? So the loss of culture, and then that's very interesting, because then someone like Terry Ingleton, maybe more so like Westphal, they'll talk about with the loss of culture. I think it's very interesting what you said, Dimitri, on the notion that the meaning crisis on another side is an unconscious crisis. There's no way to mediate the unconscious, because for all of them, without culture, then there is no shared means by which to deal with unconsciousness. Every individual is left to their own unconscious on their own to deal with it. But how do you deal with it? Like, where do you even begin? Everyone, Philip Reif will say everyone now has to be a genius about themselves. Well, how do you be a genius about themselves? Like, where do you even begin? How do you even know if you're doing a good job? Like, where do you begin? It becomes very, very difficult. So I think all of that kind of speaks on the question of what religion can do. I think also, to me, the question of authority is extremely interesting here, because what is the difference between authority and authoritarianism, right? Like, basically, authoritarianism becomes some sort of mashing together people into a manner that they do not want, or for some end that excludes the other or creates a mass. I like to make a distinction between mob and mass. And there's something about authoritarianism that creates a kind of mass, right? But then if you don't have authority, well, then it could be chaos, right? You don't have that shared intelligibility. And then I guess what I would say is I'm extremely interested in thinking about religion, communities in terms of sports, in terms of gymnasiums, in terms of athletics. I think what Cadell has been pointing to is very good. Because in athletics, like, there's just the hard facticity of the fact that that guy's a better wrestler than you because he beats you, right? It's not based on some like metaphysical notion. You all followed the shared intelligibility of the rules. We had a shared intelligibility of what the rules are in wrestling. We stepped into the ring and he beat you, or you beat him, right? There's an authority there that is quite forceful, but it's not really authoritarian, right? And this is where it would seem to me that today, to kind of escape, because when I hear Kant talking about rationality and not needing authority or whatever, there's something about a skill there, right? Like, rationality is a kind of skill, a kind of navigation. Now, of course, I'm critical of autonomous rationality. But I think what we'll increasingly see is that religion is some kind of training of skills, that then the excellence in those skills are the grounds of authority, but those are not authoritarian because they have some kind of facticity to them, right? Now, I'm not going to say it's as clear as, say, wrestling. Like, so I think about Simone Weil's attention a lot. Attention, her concept of attention is fascinating because it's really practical, but then at the same time vague, but then not vague if you do it. It's like this middle ground between religion and spirit and mysticism and all these different things, but it's a practice of giving attention. And for her, if you really give your neighbor attention, fully give yourself over to the other in terms of attention, you can radically transform the entire world, right? Okay, how do you judge who's better at attention than not, right? Well, that might be something religions have to think about. That might have to be something communities have to think about, right? And to determine those sort of metrics by which you can have authority based on a skill that isn't authoritarian, right? And I'm thinking about attention. I think about meta language as I talk with Emilio. I think about integration with lag. There's a bunch of things. Oh, the other one is Leslie Nussbaum's proper confidence. Today, instead of certainty, we have to learn how to have confidence, which is mean believe what we believe, but not be totally closed off. How do you have confidence without slipping into the temptation of certainty? Makes me think of Mr. Pascal's metaphysics of adjacency. How do we accept 99%? Which means we give up the 1%. But that totally transforms how we carry ourselves with other people in a very important way, right? Where it's not just we believe anything, but then it's also not totally closed. So there are these different kind of skills, meta skills, that seem to be the new grounds of determining authority that keeps it like wrestling, like winning a match, that are not the same as, that are not authoritarian. But in order to do that, and then I'll pass it on, I will make an example from Mr. Edmondson's wonderful book, where he talks about the difference between Hector and Achilles. And what he points out is that Achilles is pure rage. He's pure power. He's unstoppable, right? And Hector, though, it's very clear in the text that he would be a wonderful leader of Troy, that he's human. He's not just a fighter, he's also like humane, right? And that's why he's like, he would probably be a great king. But here's the problem. Because Hector is humane, he has no chance against Achilles. Achilles will obliterate him, right? And yet, you would never want Achilles leading your team, right? You would never want Achilles leading your nation, right? You would want someone like Hector. The problem with Hector is that he loses. Edmondson also makes a fascinating question. He asks this. He says, is Achilles brave? Is Achilles brave? Edmondson says, no, Achilles is not brave. He's just mad. Hector is brave, but he loses, right? Because he knows that he is not pure rage. He's also partly human, which is precisely what sets him up to be vulnerable to lose. Achilles is authoritarianism. Hector is authority. The temptation of going into authoritarianism is precisely to not be vulnerable, to not have the possibility of losing, and actually so you can avoid courage. You don't have to have courage to be an authoritarian. But to have authority, you have to have the ability of losing, you have to have the ability to possibly die, and you also have to be dialectical. You can't just be total. You have to be human and a warrior at the same time. Those are much harder skills to get than just being a pure Achilles. And if you fight Achilles, you'll lose. But if you're not someone who loses against Achilles, you're not what the world needs right now. The world right now needs in religion something more like Hector, and religion for a very long time has fallen into the temptation of being like Achilles. We're going to stop all the others. We're going to stop the barbarians at the gate. We're going to make all of America Christian, and we're going to tear it all down. The totalizing rage. We're going to get our guy in office, and then we'll save America for Christ or something like that, right? Christianity in America has not been Hector. It's fallen into the temptation of Achilles. And the question is, can we, in our binding to something greater than ourselves, be willing to put ourselves in that kind of vulnerability of Hector? Because that is where you can find courage. That is where you can find dialectics. And that's where you can find the kind of people that people need to be, who can learn things like attention and proper confidence. So to me, that framing, and I think that will all look like a religion, more like a gymnasium than a tank. But we have to be willing to create those spaces.
The things that are standing out to me from our discussion include, I liked also Cadell's image of walking on water as sort of floating on the surface of the real. And what I'd like to emphasize about that is how it's relative or variable across scales, right? So you have an image of how the trip could go, and then you get fucked by the reality of the trip. And so you fall back on violence, this human impulse, this power drive. But that power drive itself is already a very successful and impressive evolutionary harmonization of many, many subdrives over a long period of evolutionary history. So that we're in this huge sliding scale. And we want to choose the appropriate, meaningful, reality adaptive scale to try to skate on top of. Because in your rage, you are skating on top of many other forms of the real, but that's not the level we want our system to be at, and it's not the level that will help our system flourish at the moment. So I think we have to be attentive to that, and also to the possibility that there is, and I think this is where a lot of the instinct for religious redemption narratives comes from. There's a success at every scale, right? That even when you are fallen back regressively into your inchoate and dysregulated self, there's still some consistency that persists. There's still some of the organizational vector that points toward the divine in all those states. God is God because you can't get rid of him. There's always a successful integration at whatever level you're capable of encountering. So that stands out to me. Another one that stands out to me is the nature and need for something like a shamanic caste or a hierophantic class, right? Not everyone is equally capable of or equally built to be mediators with the unconscious. And if we don't have people who have the skill and capacity and inclination to be good mediators with the unconscious, then we default to superficial forms of meaning to provide that stopgap. If we don't have gardeners and people who wish to be and co-trained to be gardeners, then we're not going to get the religionification of society at any scale. So there are things that are not for everyone to do. There are things that we need specialized tasks for. And those specialized creators of culture and of ritual and of referential sharing are essential if we want to have culture. And if we don't have them and have them competent and have them socially empowered, then we will inevitably get something like a death of culture. The other part is the authority part. That's really, I think, an area where a lot more discussion could go on here. Nietzsche has this wonderful line that an instinct for variations in rank is already a sign of a high rank. And when we look at someone like Kant saying that, oh, we don't need those old forms of authority now that we have this reasoning capacity, he's also proposing that he himself is an authority of some kind who's operating well across those things. So there's a sense in which you also can never get rid of authority. But what kind of authority do we need? We need an authority that doesn't go, like Daniel was saying, into the authoritarian or into some kind of equanimity or equivalence in which there is no authority at all. Something has to mediate between those. And that's one of the fundamental dichotomies that religion has to rebind or bring back together. Just like it has to bring together the left and the right, it has to bring together the masculine and feminine. It has to find a way to integrate and harmonize constructively all the different major variations within the cultural and cognitive field. So holding that together and getting that right is essential for religious authority and any kind of authority at every phase of history. What does it look like in the contemporary phase? Well, there are some adjustments we have to make based on our current understanding of how bodies and brains and collective intelligences function. Whatever kind of authority we need now has to have some of the trappings of historical authority, but it has to fit with the needs and understandings of how authority and social function operates today. Right, there are some serious limitations on the amount of collective intelligence and collective sapience you can get out of most of the old authority models that human beings have been using. So we need the spirit of authority. We need people who are really authoritative. And to have that, we have to be able to lose, to be able to fail, to be able to encounter our limit, as Hector does rather than Achilles. But we have to do that in a way that's smarter and more permeable and more distributed and more like super competent team holding than the ancient kind of authoritative gesture, the one that's appropriate to what we understand about how people function today.
What up?
I wanted
guys.
I wanted to bring the gang in. This is where we're rocking out here. So yeah, anything you guys want to say on religion quickly?
Well, I like the Aleister Crowley quote where he says that all these modern people, they're not capable of science, they're not capable of magic, they're not even capable of religion.
And Raven, anything you want to add there?
I'm a god.
I'm an immortal god. I'm a god. I'm a god. I'm an immortal god. I'm an immortal god.
All right.
That's my contribution.
All right, I'll finish
Respects.
here. Thanks for coming in, guys.
You're the first, guys.
Big up on Captain Lay.
Right. I wanted to bring these guys in here.
That made my day.
So,
That made my day. Wow.
all right. Thanks. Thanks to everyone here. So, my thoughts here, just closing up. I want to say a little bit something, a little something on the logic of A equals B, because that's been a logic that's been guiding me. I think it started guiding me in my doctorate and has continued to be an important part of the way I think, and it also has some sort of relevance to, I think, the liminal web space in regards to the dynamics of game A and game B, which I think Daniel touched on a little bit as well. And basically, sort of when I think I was in a Dark Renaissance Stoa video where basically I was proposing the idea of we need to think the paradox of A, B instead of thinking of game A to game B. And I actually even had a conversation with Peter Limburg about that recently, and it was quite productive. But the problem with the game A to game B logic is basically that game B doesn't think enough that actually 99% of people are in game A, and that the reason why game A is the way game A is because people are struggling with sexual reproduction and child rearing. And so if your game cannot actually work with sexual reproduction and child rearing, then what you're doing is that you're just escaping one game for another game, which can only exist as paradoxically a parasite. So I know in the Stoa animated video, they represented game A as the parasite, but actually game B is the parasite. Game B is the parasite on game A, which is struggling with sexual reproduction and child rearing. Now, the paradox of this is that I think that it's not for nothing that you go fully into game B and it brings you back to game A. I don't think I think if you go fully into game B and then come back to game A, I think you actually do, even though from the outside perspective, you look the same, on the internal perspective, I think you gain everything. I think that there's a minimal difference, which is worth having done. And that was basically the conversation between Peter Limburg and I. Now, I want to bring that around to actually the end of the science of logic, where, of course, Hegel already thinks this. Hegel not only thinks game A equals B, but then he also says B equals A. So he's basically saying, yeah, you go from game A to game B, but then game B brings you back to game A. So it's a perspectival shift in which actually nothing has changed. Nothing on the external has changed, but everything on the inside has changed. And there's a big, like the big difference there is, I won't say his name, but I was at an old friend's house and he had everything on the external appearance of game A. He had the house, he had the wife, he had the kids, he had the car, he even had a movie theater in his basement. And I'm sitting there in the backyard with him, and he said to me in a moment of lack, in a moment of silence, in a moment of absence of conversation, he said, "Is this it?" And I was like, boom. He didn't go game A to game B and then game B to game A. He just stayed in game A. And when you just stay in game A, you accumulate everything on the external view of what you think is the telos, or what you think is beautiful. But actually you're left there with the car and the house and the movie theater in the goddamn basement. And you say, is this it? Because you didn't do the spiritual journey. You didn't do the spiritual search. Now, another thing that I want to comment on is that A equals B, B equals A. This logic can also be framed as I equals other and other equals I. Now, Alenka has a brilliant reflection in What is Sex about I equals other and other equals I in regards to Adam Smith and capitalism. And I want to emphasize this because what I was saying about what I was saying about the secrets of the neoliberal capitalists were secrets to the neoliberal capitalists themselves. So she was saying about the Adam Smith and the idea of the invisible hand is that Adam Smith was correct to emphasize that if you just follow your own self-interest in the market, that this is actually a good thing. Like, you can organize a society based on your own self-interest on the market. So, for example, I'm not going to go to Daniel or Layman or you, Dimitri, and say, hey, could you buy my course because I really need the money, right? Like, that's not the whole point of Adam Smith's logic. Is that I build such a good product that you naturally want it and you naturally benefit from it, and it's genuinely valuable, right? So you do have to build something which is genuinely valuable. You can't just appeal to the fact that, hey, I'm broke and I need you to buy my product. However, what she says Adam Smith's logic missed was the logic of the other enjoying itself in regards to the market. So this is, for example, the idea that if everyone follows their own individual self-interest on the market starts enjoying itself so much that it basically jerks off on our head. And that's basically the excess value. That's basically the exchange value of capital, where basically the market enjoys itself so much that it's totally disconnected from human needs. And I think that's where we need to think is the antagonism between the self and the market, which is enjoying itself too much. And we have no way to regulate this market on the level of global techno-capitalism. And this is going to be a huge problem in the age of artificial intelligence. It's going to explode in the age of artificial intelligence. I think it already has exploded in the age of artificial intelligence. So one more thing before I finish is that Daniel and Layman are both people who have inspired me, and I think they're beautiful in their movement. And two of the things that have inspired me a lot in their thinking, which I would encourage people to investigate on their own, because these are things which have stayed with me. The first is Daniel's idea of the true is not the rational. And this can also be framed in the idea of the true is non-rational. And like, if you really think with this and you keep thinking, and it's not against reason, but it's just realizing that there's a dimension of your reason which has to submit, or else if your reason does not submit, you're constantly going to be struggling with resistances which you think are irrational, but actually they're just the truth. And this is very important in two dimensions. And this is something that I've sort of worked with in my own way, is libidinal economy. The true is not rational in sexuality and in economics and politics. The true is not rational, but you still have to work with it. And if you don't work with it, you're going to get leveled by it. And then with Layman's work, not just the metaphysics of adjacency, but specific aspects of the metaphysics of adjacency, which I think are extremely important. And I don't, the two that stick out to me, and we'll see if Layman thinks thinks in the same way, is one, the accepting the impossibility of fusion, like basically accepting the impossibility of fullness of like Daniel said, 100%. And you have to really work with that also in the level of sexuality and economics, is the impossibility of the full fusion, the impossibility of the full identity. And the other thing is that identity is always a not quiteness. That identity is not quiteness. And that means it's not that my identity is not quite, it's that your identity is not quite, and that is your actual process. So I'll end with that. And also just, I want to thank also Dimitri. You were a great host, and it's always a pleasure.
Well, thank you very much. I can really speak to what you said about both the capitalist symptoms that self-enjoy and just totally go beyond our human needs, as well as personal symptoms which enjoy themselves and totally go beyond our own needs. the first thing we have to acknowledge here is that we are completely powerless to them. If we don't take this step, then we're never gonna solve them. And actually, that saying that you're completely powerless over against these symptoms, whether they are, the capitalist society we live in, or our personal symptoms, this does not negate our self-responsibility. This is actually entailing our self-responsibility. And only if we feel truly responsible and still can be honest with ourselves and posit the fact that we are completely powerless over against them, that actually opens up transformation, which is a crucial point. This not quiteness is, of course, ever present. The difference, however, is though, whether it be religion, philosophy, or art, you can see the same thing occurring, and that is that if you write philosophy, or if you're, let's say, a religious teacher or a preacher, or you're a great artist and make music, you will be in the phenomenological process of actually building up to that result, to the artwork, the paper, the institution with its rituals. Those people on the other side who are receiving that art or those rituals, if they are truly beautiful, which is up to those people, of course, and if it really presents value to them, stimulates transference. This is what that does. Of course, we're very familiar with how crazy people are about artists, but this is also a hugely important topic in philosophy. And now it's true that not everyone can become a religious teacher or a philosophy teacher or a great artist. It's possible that, with the mediation of that process of, living with the not quietness and sometimes hating yourself because you cannot live up to what you want to bring forth, and all of that, is that even though you can never communicate that process, you can still include it into the result. And this is where that beauty can stem from. So with that, thank you everyone for joining the conversation. Thank you, Daniel. Happy anniversary. Thank you, Cadell, and thank you, Layman. Also, credits to Owen Cox and Raven Connolly. And have a great evening, everyone.